When a snowstorm seals a lonely manor from the outside world, Holmes realizes the danger is not what cannot enter, but what has been waiting inside all along. Before we drift into tonight's mystery, you're warmly invited to subscribe, so these quiet stories can keep you company whenever the night feels long. The snow had begun as a courteous thing, light and almost apologetic, drifting down from a sky the colour of worn linen. Watson had remarked upon it with mild approval as the carriage left the last village behind, noting how neatly the flakes settled upon hedgerows and the dark shoulders of the road. Holmes, seated opposite him, offered no reply. His gaze was fixed outward, following the slow, deliberate descent of winter upon the countryside. By the time the manor's name was spoken again by the driver, barely audible above the soft crunch of hooves, the snow had grown more insistent. It no longer drifted. It advanced. The road narrowed as they climbed into higher ground, its edges blurring until it became less a path than a suggestion. Bare trees stood on either side, their branches etched white, arching overhead like the ribs of some immense, sleeping creature. The carriage lamps cast a fragile glow that seemed to be swallowed almost immediately by the thickening air. Watson drew his coat closer. "We should have reached the turnoff by now," he said, peering through the small window. Holmes's eyes flicked briefly to the ruts ahead. "We have," he replied calmly. "We simply no longer recognize it." The driver reined in the horses, muttering under his breath as snow crept steadily into the impressions left moments before. The tracks behind them softened, blurred, then vanished entirely beneath a fresh, seamless layer of white. Watson watched this with a growing unease. "Holmes," he said quietly, "the road is disappearing." "Yes," Holmes agreed, and with admirable efficiency. The wind rose then, not violently, but with a steady, purposeful breath that carried the snow sideways, erasing distinctions, smoothing the land into a single unbroken surface. What had once been a road, a hedge, a field now shared the same pale identity. They moved on at reduced speed, the carriage swaying gently as the horses felt their way forward, more by instinct than sight. The world contracted to the circle of lamplight and the muffled rhythm of hooves. Sound itself seemed reluctant to travel, wrapped and muted by the snow. After some time, Watson glanced back again, though he knew what he would find. There was nothing. No trace of passage. No suggestion that they had come from anywhere at all. "It's as though we're the first to pass this way," he murmured. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile, or the last. The driver called back that the manor lay just ahead, though Watson could see nothing to confirm it. Then, gradually, the suggestion of structure emerged from the white. A dark line here, a vertical shadow there, until the manor revealed itself, not rising from the landscape so much as having waited within it. The house stood broad and immobile, its windows dark, save for a single glow deep within. Snow clung to its stonework, filling crevices and softening edges, as though the storm were attempting to preserve it rather than bury it. The carriage came to a halt at the gates, which were already half lost beneath drifts. As Holmes stepped down, his boots sank several inches into untouched snow. "No tracks," Watson observed, joining him. "Not even the driver's." Holmes surveyed the ground with quiet interest. "The storm arrived before we did," he said, "and intends to ensure we remain." The driver hesitated, glancing nervously at the blank whiteness behind them. "I'll not be able to take you back tonight, sirs," he said. "The road's gone." Holmes nodded. "Quite so." As they approached the manor doors, Watson felt a peculiar sensation. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of finality. The snow did not merely block the way behind them, it sealed it, smoothing over choice and retreat with impartial calm. When the heavy doors opened to admit them, warmth spilled out in welcome contrast. along with the faint scent of wood smoke and old stone. The world of snow and wind fell away behind them, closing as softly as the doors themselves. Inside, the manor waited, patient, enclosed, and entirely unconcerned with the vanished road that had brought them there. Holmes paused just inside the threshold, brushing snow from his sleeve. "Well, Watson," he said quietly, "it seems the storm has made the first decision on our behalf." Outside, the snow continued its steady work, erasing the last evidence that any road had ever led to the manor at all. The doors closed behind them with a weighty finality, shutting out the whispering wind and the slow, relentless hush of falling snow. For a moment, Holmes and Watson stood in the entry hall, allowing their eyes to adjust to the softer, amber-lit interior. The contrast was striking. Outside, the world had been reduced to motionless white and drifting shadow. Inside, warmth lingered, yet it was a warmth that felt carefully maintained, as though it had been preserved rather than lived in. The hall was spacious, its stone floor worn smooth by generations of passage. Heavy tapestries lined the walls, their colours muted by age and candlelight, depicting pastoral scenes that seemed almost ironic in the present circumstances. A broad staircase rose at the far end, its banister carved with intricate designs that caught the light and released it again in dull glimmers. The air carried the scent of burning logs and old wood, layered with something subtler, polish perhaps, or the faint trace of lavender long ago pressed into drawers. No one spoke. A man stood near the foot of the stairs, his posture formal, hands clasped behind his back. He might have been mistaken for a statue, save for the slight tightening of his shoulders as the door shut. He was tall, spare, and dressed with meticulous restraint, his dark suit sharply at odds with the encroaching winter outside. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His voice was low and measured, as if raised sounds might disturb the house itself. "Welcome to Brackenfell Manor." Watson glanced instinctively behind them, half expecting to see the snow pressing against the door, listening. The man introduced himself as Mr. Calder, the steward, and gestured for them to remove their coats. A fire crackled somewhere beyond the hall. Its presence felt more than seen. As Watson handed over his coat, he noticed how the silence lingered. It was not the comfortable quiet of a country house at rest, nor the bustling hush of servants at work. It was something suspended, an interval stretched thin. "Your journey was uneventful?" Calder asked, though his eyes suggested he already knew the answer. "Entirely," Holmes replied, "until it wasn't." Calder inclined his head, accepting this without comment. "The storm arrived early this year. It has a habit of isolating us." "So it seems," Watson said, glancing toward the curtained windows. No light filtered through them, as though the snow had pressed itself flat against the glass. They were led into a drawing room where several figures had gathered, each positioned with careful distance from the others. Conversation ceased upon their entrance, as though it had been resting rather than flowing. A woman seated near the hearth rose slightly, then thought better of it, settling back with a controlled motion that betrayed tension beneath composure. Introductions were made in low voices, a distant cousin of the house's owner, a visiting academic delayed by weather, a local physician accustomed to long winters and longer silences. Each face carried the same expression, polite attentiveness edged with something unspoken. Watson felt it keenly, the sense that the house was not merely sheltering them from the storm, but containing something already present. Holmes, for his part, absorbed it all without remark. His gaze moved slowly from the arrangement of furniture to the placement of doors, the alignment of windows, the deliberate spacing of chairs. He noted the absence of certain sounds, no footsteps overhead, no clatter from adjoining rooms, no murmur of servants beyond the immediate space. "How many are in residence?" he asked mildly. Calder hesitated for a fraction of a second. 6 guests, including yourselves, and staff, of course. And yet, Holmes said, one hears very little of them. The steward offered a faint, practiced smile. Brackenfell has always been restrained. A log shifted in the fire, releasing a sharp crack that made several of the guests start. The sound echoed briefly, then was swallowed by the stillness once more. Tea was served, cups placed with unnecessary care, as though noise itself were discouraged. Watson noticed that no one reached for sugar, and that spoons were stirred only once, if at all. Even the fire seemed to burn with restraint. Holmes accepted his cup, but did not drink. "How long has the storm been upon you?" he asked. "Since before dusk," Calder replied, though the house felt different even earlier. "Different how?" Watson asked. The steward's gaze flicked briefly toward the staircase, as if it were waiting. No one contradicted him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, piling silently against stone and glass. Inside, Brackenfell Manor remained perfectly still, its occupants gathered within it like pieces on a board, suspended in a pause that had begun well before Holmes and Watson crossed its threshold. And in that silence, the house seemed to listen. Night settled over Brackenfell Manor with a thoroughness that felt deliberate. The storm beyond its walls had not lessened, nor had it grown more violent. Instead, the snow fell with unwavering persistence, pressing the world into stillness. Curtains were drawn, lamps lowered, and one by one the occupants of the house withdrew to their rooms, carrying with them the quiet unease that had lingered throughout the evening. Watson lay awake longer than he would have liked, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the manor adjusting to the cold, the soft sigh of timber, the distant settling of stone. Holmes, in the adjoining room, had long since fallen into his peculiar half-rest. Alert yet motionless, his breathing so shallow, Watson often wondered whether he slept at all. It was some time after midnight when the sound came. At first, Watson thought it a trick of his own imagination, the echo of a footstep remembered rather than heard. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate, a measured tread moving somewhere beyond the walls of his room. He sat up at once. The footsteps did not rush. They did not hesitate. They crossed the distance with unhurried confidence, as though the walker knew precisely where they were going. Leather on stone, then wood, then stone again, a pattern that suggested corridors Watson had not yet walked. He rose quietly and crossed to the door, opening it just enough to let the sound reach him more clearly. The hallway lay empty. Lamps turned low, their light barely touching the far end of the passage. Another step. Closer now. Watson felt the unmistakable tightening in his chest that came when reason struggled to assert itself against instinct. He stepped into the corridor. At that exact moment, another door opened down the hall. Holmes emerged, fully dressed, his expression composed. "You hear it too," Holmes said softly. Watson nodded. "It's moving toward the west wing." They proceeded together, their own footsteps careful, subdued. The sound ahead of them neither quickened nor faded. It continued at the same measured pace, passing through a section of the house Holmes recalled had been sealed earlier in the evening. They stopped before a heavy oak door, its surface scarred with age, a brass lock newly polished but firmly set. The footsteps continued, unmistakably beyond it. Watson placed his hand against the wood. It was cold, still. Holmes tested the handle. It did not yield. "Locked," Watson whispered. "And unused," Holmes replied. "Judging by the dust." The footsteps slowed, then ceased. For a moment the silence pressed in so completely that Watson became aware of his own pulse. Then, faint but distinct, the sound resumed, now retreating, moving away down a corridor that, by all accounts, should not have existed. A door creaked open behind them. Mr. Calder stood there, lantern in hand, his face pale but controlled. Behind him, 2 other guests had emerged, drawn by the same sound. "You heard it," Calder said quietly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And you were not surprised." Calder hesitated. "We hoped it would not happen tonight." One of the guests, the woman from the hearth, clasped her shawl tighter. "It never leaves tracks," she said. "Not in daylight, not in dust." Another guest spoke, voice low and strained. "It knows when the house is closed." Holmes raised a hand gently, stilling the murmurs. "How long has this been occurring?" "Since before the storm," Calder admitted. "But only after dark." "And always in the sealed wing?" "Yes." Holmes turned his attention back to the locked door, studying the frame, the hinges, the faint scuff marks where time had worn patterns deeper than footsteps ever could. "Has anyone attempted to open it?" Watson asked. Calder shook his head. "The keys were removed years ago." The footsteps returned once more, now above them, crossing a ceiling no one used, pacing directly overhead, each step falling with uncanny precision. Watson looked upward involuntarily. "There is no upper passage there," Calder said, reading the movement in his gaze. Holmes listened intently, his head tilted slightly, his eyes half-lidded. "Nevertheless," he murmured, "something is walking." The sound faded gradually, as though the walker had passed beyond the boundaries of the house itself. When it was gone, the silence that followed felt deeper, more intentional. Holmes straightened. "We shall not pursue it tonight." Watson looked at him in surprise. "You're certain?" "Quite," Holmes said. "Whatever is creating those footsteps wants to be heard, but not yet seen." He turned back toward the corridor, already committing the pattern of sound and space to memory. Behind them, the locked door remained undisturbed, its secrets intact, while Brackenfell Manor settled once more into watchful stillness, waiting for the footsteps to return. Morning arrived reluctantly at Brackenfell Manor. Its light filtered through layers of cloud and snow so thick that the day seemed unsure of itself. The storm had continued through the night with tireless consistency, sealing the house in a white silence that pressed gently but firmly against every wall and window. When Watson drew back the heavy curtains, he found the world outside transformed into a smooth, unbroken expanse, as though the land itself had been erased and rewritten. Holmes was already awake. He stood by the front doors, coat fastened, boots prepared, studying the faint glow seeping through the frosted glass. His expression held none of the fatigue Watson felt after a restless night. If anything, Holmes appeared invigorated by the quiet certainty of the storm. "They say the snow began before dusk," Holmes remarked, more to the house than to Watson, "and it has not ceased since." Mr. Calder appeared with a lantern and a ring of keys, though his hesitation suggested the keys were more symbolic than useful. The doors were unbarred and with some effort pushed open. A breath of cold air entered at once, sharp and clean, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and iron. The grounds lay untouched. Snow covered the steps, the path, the lawn beyond, all smoothed into gentle curves without a single interruption. No prints, no marks of passage. Even the gate at the far edge of the drive stood half buried, its hinges frozen in place, the drift piled high against it like a deliberate barricade. Watson stepped forward carefully, leaving the first impression upon the snow. His boot sank cleanly, compressing the surface with a sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness. "No one has crossed this," he said quietly. Holmes moved slowly, his gaze tracking the terrain with methodical precision. He examined the edges of the house where stone met snow, the base of the walls, the narrow gaps beneath shuttered windows. He knelt briefly, brushing aside a small drift to inspect the ground beneath, then straightened again. "There has been no movement," he confirmed. "Not since the storm began." They circled the manor together, their progress unhurried. Snow clung to the eaves, hung heavy upon the branches of nearby trees, and softened every boundary until distance became difficult to judge. A nearby stable stood sealed, its doors crusted with ice. The outbuildings were similarly entombed, their outlines barely discernible against the white. "And yet," Watson said, recalling the night before, "we heard footsteps." "Yes," Holmes replied. "Footsteps that belonged to no one who walked here." They returned toward the house, Holmes pausing often to examine small details. The angle of drift against walls, the subtle variations in accumulation that spoke of wind patterns rather than passage. "There are disturbances," Holmes said at last, "but none made by feet." Watson followed his gaze to a narrow depression along the side of the house where snow lay thinner, sculpted into faint ridges. "The wind," Watson ventured. "Precisely," Holmes said. "The snow tells a story, Watson, but not the one people expect. It reveals not presence, but absence." They stood once more at the entrance, looking back across the untouched expanse. "If someone had entered or left," Holmes continued, "even by night, even with care, the snow would remember. It remembers everything that presses upon it." Calder shifted uneasily beside them. "Then the sounds—" "Did not come from outside," Holmes said gently. The implication settled heavily. The footsteps had not belonged to an intruder, nor could they be attributed to some restless guest wandering the halls in secret. They returned indoors, closing the doors against the cold. As the warmth reclaimed them, Watson felt the unease deepen rather than recede. "A house that no one can enter," he murmured, "yet something walks within it." Holmes removed his gloves, his expression thoughtful rather than troubled. "When the exterior offers no answers," he said, "one must look inward." Behind them, the snow continued to fall, covering even Watson's fresh footprints, erasing their brief intrusion as thoroughly as it had erased the road that led to Brackenfell Manor. Outside, nothing had come or gone. Inside, something waited. The manor revealed its secrets reluctantly, and only to those patient enough to look without expectation. Holmes moved through Brackenfell with the unhurried attentiveness of a man reading a familiar language written in an unfamiliar hand. He did not question the house aloud. He listened to it. Watson followed at a respectful distance, careful not to disturb the rhythm Holmes established as he examined walls, door frames, and staircases with quiet precision. The manor's interior was impressive without being ostentatious. High ceilings supported by dark beams, corridors that curved gently rather than meeting at right angles, and rooms whose proportions suggested they had been adapted over time rather than designed all at once. "It's older than it pretends to be," Holmes murmured at last, resting his hand against the panelling of a long gallery. "And younger in places where it should not be." He pressed lightly along the wall, fingertips sensitive to subtle variations in resistance. Watson had seen this behaviour before, in London townhouses, abandoned factories, even once aboard a ship, moments when Holmes read structure as others read expression. They paused before a portrait whose frame was slightly askew. The subject, a severe-looking gentleman rendered in sombre oils, gazed outward with a confidence that suggested ownership rather than decoration. Holmes examined the frame closely, then the wall surrounding it. "This was not placed for admiration," he said quietly. He applied pressure. The frame shifted with a muted click, sliding aside to reveal a narrow recess behind it. No passage opened fully, but the depth was unmistakable, a space deliberately concealed. Watson exhaled softly. A hiding place. A listening place, Holmes corrected. Observe the height. Ear level when standing. They moved on, Holmes increasingly animated by the house's responses to his scrutiny. Floorboards changed tone beneath their feet. A subtle hollow note where solid timber should have been. In one corridor, Holmes paused and counted steps, then reversed direction and counted again, his brow creasing faintly. "The distance does not agree," he said. "This passage is longer than the rooms it connects." He traced the line with his gaze, then rapped gently against the wall with his knuckles. The sound returned altered, softened, absorbed. "A false wall," Watson said. "Yes, and not a recent one." They found a narrow staircase concealed behind a linen cupboard, its steps worn smooth by use that had ceased long before the present occupants arrived. Dust lay thick upon it, undisturbed, yet the wear told its own story. "Generations," Holmes murmured. "This house was built not merely to shelter, but to conceal." As they continued, the architecture began to reveal a pattern. Corridors that aligned imperfectly, rooms that shared walls without sharing dimensions, fireplaces that backed onto empty voids rather than neighbouring hearths. Holmes sketched it all in his mind, assembling a map not of what was visible, but of what had been deliberately hidden. "Why go to such lengths?" Watson asked quietly. Holmes paused near the base of the sealed wing, studying the door they had encountered the night before. "Because privacy once required effort," he said, "and secrets were not abstractions but physical things, documents, people, movements, that needed space to exist unseen." He examined the hinges, noting their age. "This wing was not sealed to prevent entry," he added. "It was sealed to prevent discovery." They retraced their steps slowly, Holmes now attentive to sound as well as structure. In certain places, footsteps echoed differently, as though the house contained hollows that caught and redirected noise. "The footsteps," Watson said softly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Not footsteps at all, reflections." The house, it seemed, had been designed to speak without revealing its speaker. Sound travelled through channels carved long ago, emerging where no corridor existed, retreating where walls appeared solid. By the time they returned to the drawing room, the manor no longer felt merely old. It felt intentional. "This house remembers," Holmes said, settling into a chair at last. "And it remembers how to lie." Watson looked around with new understanding. At the tapestries that concealed seams, the furniture positioned just so, the lamps that illuminated some corners while leaving others in shadow. "And the storm?" Watson asked. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Merely encouragement. Snow silences the outside world. Architecture does the rest." The manor remained still around them, its secrets once again quiet, but no longer invisible. The snow continued its patient vigil outside, sealing Brackenfell Manor within a world of white silence, while Holmes turned his attention inward, toward memories rather than walls. He understood that architecture alone could only explain how something moved unseen. To learn why, one had to listen to people, and to the quiet places where stories had been set aside rather than told. It began in the library. The room lay at the heart of the manor, its shelves rising to the ceiling like dark, watchful sentinels. Leather-bound volumes filled the walls, their spines softened by age and infrequent handling. A fire burned low in the grate, casting a subdued glow that seemed reluctant to disturb the dust motes suspended in the air. Holmes moved among the shelves with familiarity, as though he had expected this room long before entering it. Watson took a seat near the fire, while Mr. Calder stood uncertainly by the door, hands clasped in front of him. "This house has been altered many times," Holmes said calmly, running a finger along a row of ledgers. "Altered for comfort, for fashion, for convenience. Yet one change was never made. Calder swallowed. You mean the West Wing? Holmes nodded. Sealed, but not forgotten. At Holmes's request, Calder retrieved several old record books, household accounts, maintenance logs, correspondence bound with ribbon gone brittle with time. They were placed gently upon the table, opened with care that bordered on reverence. Watson observed as Holmes leafed through them, his attention narrowing, his pace slowing as dates repeated themselves with subtle irregularity. Here, Holmes said softly, stopping at an entry nearly 40 years old. Repairs to the West Wing. Structural reinforcement. And then nothing. Calder leaned closer. That was the winter Lord Ashcombe died. Died? Watson echoed. Calder hesitated. Officially. The word lingered, heavy with implication. Holmes's eyes lifted. And unofficially. The steward's gaze drifted toward the window, where snow pressed gently against the glass. His younger brother, Elias, vanished that same winter. The matter was set aside. Set aside. Watson had learned that phrase often carried more weight than outright denial. Tell us, Holmes said gently. Calder exhaled slowly, as though releasing something long held. Elias Ashcombe lived in the West Wing. He was not well regarded. A quiet man. Brilliant, some said. Obsessive, others. He kept odd hours, asked for changes to the house, passages, alcoves, soundproofing. Holmes glanced briefly toward Watson, then back to the records. When Lord Ashcombe fell ill, Calder continued, Elias withdrew almost entirely. After the funeral, he was simply gone. No body, no farewell. The family declared him unstable and presumed him dead. And the wing? Watson asked. Sealed shortly after. It was said the memories were too painful. Holmes turned another page. Or too inconvenient. They found a letter tucked into the back of one ledger, its ink faded but legible. Holmes read silently, then passed it to Watson. It spoke of disputes, of inheritance, of fears that Elias knew something he should not, of a house altered not for eccentricity, but for concealment. The storm, Watson murmured. It happened then too. Yes, Holmes replied. The same winter, heavy snow, roads blocked, isolation. A disappearance perfectly timed to be lost beneath weather and grief. Holmes closed the ledger gently. Elias Ashcombe did not leave, he said, nor did he die. Calder's face had gone pale. You think he hid himself? I think, Holmes said carefully, that he designed this house to outlive his presence, that the footsteps are not a haunting, but an echo, architecture repeating a path long walked. Watson felt a chill unrelated to the fire. You believe someone has been moving through those passages all this time? Or that something was set in motion and never dismantled, Holmes replied. A system that requires no living caretaker. Sound, movement, illusion, preserved like a mechanism wound and left to run. Outside, the snow fell on, bearing the past with gentle insistence. Inside, the manor's silence felt different now, not merely tense, but weighted with memory. A man had vanished here once, swallowed not by winter, but by design. And Brackenfell Manor had been keeping his secret ever since. The West Wing waited behind its locked door with a patience that felt practiced. Unlike the rest of the manor, which bore the gentle disorder of lived-in rooms, this section of Brackenfell remained immaculate in its neglect. Dust lay thin and even along the skirting boards, not thick with abandonment, but settled carefully, as though no one wished to disturb it more than necessary. Holmes stood before the door for some time without touching it. The brass handle had been polished recently, not to invite use, but to preserve the appearance of readiness. A contradiction Watson found increasingly common within the house. "It is sealed," Watson said softly, "yet not forgotten." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "True abandonment leaves scars. This has been curated." Mr. Calder arrived with the lantern, his expression guarded. "No one enters the west wing," he said. It was Lord Ashcombe's final instruction. "And yet," Holmes observed, "the oil in the hinges is fresh." Calder said nothing. The corridor leading to the wing was narrower than the others, its proportions subtly altered to discourage lingering. The walls bore fewer decorations. The lamps were spaced farther apart, casting longer shadows that softened detail and invited the imagination to complete what sight could not. At the sealed door, Holmes crouched, examining the lower edge. "No drafts," he murmured. "The wing is not open to the elements." "Unsafe," Watson echoed the word Calder had used earlier. "In what sense?" Calder's grip tightened on the lantern. "Unstable floors, weak supports. That is what the family was told." "But not what you believe," Holmes said gently. Calder hesitated, then shook his head. "It has been maintained, quietly, roof repairs, stone reinforcement, only enough to keep it intact." They stepped back as Holmes straightened. "Unsafe," he said, "is a word often chosen when the truth is inconvenient rather than dangerous." Holmes traced the outline of the doorframe with his eyes. The craftsmanship was older than the rest of the manor, the joinery precise, almost obsessive. He pressed his ear briefly to the wood. Nothing. And yet the silence here felt different, contained rather than empty. Watson felt it too, the sense that beyond the door lay not decay, but order, frozen in time. "The footsteps," Watson said quietly. "They always pass near here." "Yes," Holmes replied, "because sound travels where space once existed." Holmes produced a small notebook and sketched quickly, mapping the known corridors against the false walls they had discovered earlier. His pencil paused, then moved again, filling a gap where no room officially appeared. "There," he said, "a narrow passage running parallel to this wing. Concealed when the door was sealed, but not removed." Calder's breath caught. "That's impossible." Holmes smiled faintly. "It is improbable, which is how secrets survive." They did not attempt to force the door. Holmes had no intention of confronting the wing directly. Not yet. Instead, he studied its perimeter, the ceiling above, the floor beneath. In one spot, the sound of the lantern's step returned subtly altered, echoing back with a delay that betrayed hidden depth. "This wing was designed to appear dangerous," Holmes said, "so that no one would question why it remained closed." "And Elias Ashcombe?" Watson asked. Holmes considered the door once more. Either he vanished within it, or he ensured that even his absence would continue to move through this house. As they turned away, Watson glanced back. The door stood unchanged, its surface unmarked, its lock untested. Yet the wing did not feel asleep. It felt contained. Behind them, the manor settled once more into its restrained quiet. But Watson could not shake the impression that the West Wing had been listening, not with anticipation, but with recognition. Whatever lay beyond that door had not been abandoned. It had been preserved. The explanation, when Holmes finally offered it, came without drama. There was no gathering of guests by candlelight, no sudden unveiling behind a tapestry. Instead, it arrived quietly, as all truths did in Holmes's hands, shaped not to astonish, but to settle. They were standing once more in the long gallery where the first hollow echoes had betrayed the house's dishonesty. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, and the storm outside had softened to a patient fall. less intent now on concealment than on endurance. The manor seemed calmer, as though some internal tension had eased simply because Holmes had stopped pretending not to see it. "The footsteps," Holmes said, resting his hand lightly against the wall, "were never meant to frighten you." Watson raised an eyebrow. "They have been rather successful at it regardless." Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. Fear is merely a byproduct. The true purpose was certainty. Certainty of what? That no one would look too closely. Holmes motioned for Watson to step back, then pressed against a specific panel with controlled pressure. The wall responded with a soft, almost apologetic shift. A narrow aperture opened, barely wide enough to admit light, revealing a concealed channel running between walls. "Sound," Holmes continued, "is easily persuaded. It obeys structure, follows invitation, and repeats what it is taught." He produced a small metal sphere from his pocket, unremarkable at first glance, and rolled it gently along the floor. The faint clink echoed, but not where Watson expected. The sound emerged several yards away, deeper, heavier, as though a man had taken a single step and stopped. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "That's exactly how it sounds." "Yes," Holmes said, "because it was designed to." They walked slowly, Holmes pointing out subtle features Watson might never have noticed alone. Slight grooves beneath the skirting boards, narrow cavities above door frames, hollow spaces between support beams that acted not as structural weaknesses, but as conduits. "The house amplifies and redirects sound," Holmes explained. "A step taken here may be heard there. A movement in one corridor echoes in another. And when combined with timing, always after midnight, always when silence is most complete, the effect becomes persuasive." "But who would build such a thing?" Watson asked. "Someone who wished to be unfindable," Holmes replied, "or someone who wished to ensure that others would never linger." They stopped near the sealed west wing. Holmes gestured toward the door. "The illusion of haunting discourages curiosity. People avoid what unsettles them. They accept explanations that absolve them of responsibility to investigate." "A ghost is easier than a secret," Watson said. "Infinitely," Holmes agreed. Holmes described how Elias Ashcombe had used the house itself as a mechanism. The concealed passages allowed for movement without presence. Weighted devices, once set, could release sound hours later as temperatures shifted. Even the storm played its part, muffling inconsistencies while heightening imagination. "The footsteps are not new," Holmes said. "They have been repeating for decades, triggered by conditions rather than intent." Watson absorbed this slowly. "So there is no one walking now?" "No," Holmes replied. "Only the memory of a design still functioning." "And the purpose?" Holmes looked thoughtful. "To ensure that the west wing remained closed, that no one asked why it was sealed, yet so carefully maintained. Fear preserves secrets better than locks." They stood in silence for a moment, the house around them suddenly less threatening, though no less complex. The footsteps, once ominous, now felt almost pitiable. Echoes trapped in service of a long-dead intention. "The haunting," Watson said quietly, "was never about the past." "No," Holmes replied. "It was about protecting it." The manor creaked softly as the temperature shifted, a natural sound this time, unmanipulated and honest. Holmes closed the concealed panel with gentle care, restoring the illusion without ceremony. "Once you understand a trick," he said, "it loses its authority." Watson glanced down the corridor, half expecting to hear the sound again. Nothing came. Only the subdued hush of a house, no longer pretending to be something it was not. The haunting had never been real, but the secret it guarded very much was. By the third night, the storm no longer felt incidental. It had settled into the landscape with an almost deliberate patience, layering the world in silence, smoothing edges, softening sound. What had first appeared as an inconvenience, a delay, an isolation imposed by nature, now revealed itself as something more cooperative, as though winter itself had agreed to participate. Holmes stood once again at the tall window overlooking the grounds, watching the snow fall in steady, disciplined sheets. No wind disturbed it now. Each flake descended with quiet purpose, erasing yesterday as efficiently as it erased the hour before. The storm did not create this, Holmes said at last. It was anticipated. Watson joined him, gazing out across the blank expanse where gardens and paths once existed. You think it was planned for? I think it was relied upon. He turned from the window and began pacing slowly, the rhythm of his steps careful, unhurried. Isolation provides opportunity. Silence provides cover. Time, uninterrupted by scrutiny, allows arrangements that would otherwise be questioned. Watson recalled the records, the sealed wing, the carefully maintained abandonment. You believe Elias Ashcombe used the winter itself? Yes, Holmes replied, not as a weapon, but as a collaborator. The idea settled uneasily. Winter as accomplice rather than obstacle. Snow as concealment rather than inconvenience. In heavy winters, Holmes continued, travel ceased, communication slowed, curiosity turned inward. A disappearance could be attributed to weather, a death to illness, a sealed wing to prudence. Watson remembered Calder's words, that the storm had come early that year, that it had isolated the manor completely. Someone needed time, Watson said slowly. Time to vanish, or to ensure something remained undiscovered. Holmes inclined his head. Time to construct permanence. They returned to the library, where the fire burned lower now, and shadows stretched long between shelves. Holmes retrieved one final document, overlooked at first glance because it seemed unimportant, a ledger of winter provisions. Coal deliveries, preserved foods, candles ordered in unusual quantity. Preparedness, Holmes said, not fear, forethought. Watson studied the list. Enough to last months. Yes, enough to outweigh curiosity. Holmes explained how the storm's arrival coincided with the sealing of the West Wing, how the illusion of danger discouraged intrusion during the one season when the house would be fully isolated. No visitors, no inspectors, no accidental discoveries. The snow ensured no one could arrive unexpectedly, Holmes said, and no one could leave to seek help. Watson felt the weight of it then. The storm wasn't meant to trap someone inside, he said. It was meant to trap a secret. Holmes stopped pacing. Precisely. The footsteps, the haunting, the warnings, all of it encouraged compliance. Guests stayed close to firelit rooms. Servants avoided unused corridors. The West Wing became myth before it could be examined. Winter teaches people to accept confinement, Holmes said. They endure rather than investigate. Outside, the snow thickened again, coating the windows in soft opacity. The manor felt suspended, cocooned not just by walls, but by season itself. And now? Watson asked. Holmes's gaze returned briefly to the sealed door down the corridor. Now the storm has outlived its usefulness. He spoke without triumph. There was no victory in exposing such careful patience, only resolution. When the snow melts, Holmes said, what has been hidden must either adapt or be revealed. Elias Ashcombe understood that winter could preserve a secret. He did not account for one thing. And that is? Watson asked. Holmes met his gaze calmly. That observation, endures longer than weather. The house creaked softly as the temperature shifted. Somewhere within its walls, the mechanisms that had whispered footsteps and warnings lay dormant, their purpose fulfilled long ago. Outside, the snow continued to fall, no longer conspirator, but relic, and Brackenfell Manor, stripped slowly of its seasonal ally, waited for the truth it had been protecting to finally step into the light. The change came quietly, as such changes often do. There was no sudden rush of warmth, no dramatic collapse of drifts or cracking of ice. Instead, dawn arrived with a subtle easing of the world, a lightening of shadows that suggested winter's grip had loosened its hold, if only slightly. Watson noticed it first in the sound. The manor no longer felt muffled. The heavy hush that had pressed against walls and corridors softened, allowing small, ordinary noises to return. Somewhere below, a door closed with a gentle finality. The fire shifted in its grate. Even the house itself seemed to breathe more freely, timbers settling not with tension, but release. Holmes stood near the window, watching as the first hint of colour touched the snowbound grounds. The white expanse beyond the glass no longer appeared untouched, but pliant. Edges blurred, surfaces softened. The storm, once absolute, had begun to surrender. "It is enough," Holmes said quietly. Watson joined him. Outside, faint impressions had begun to appear where none existed before. Shallow depressions, subtle signs of weight returning to the world. The snow was no longer erasing. It was remembering. The occupants of Brackenfell gathered without being summoned. They assembled in the drawing room, drawn by something they could not name but instinctively recognized as resolution. Calder stood near the hearth, his posture less rigid now, as though a burden had been eased from his shoulders. The others took their places in silence, their faces expectant rather than fearful. Holmes spoke without ceremony. "The West Wing was never unsafe," he said. "It was protected, not from collapse, but from discovery." He explained calmly, patiently, how Elias Ashcombe had used winter's isolation to withdraw from the visible life of the house, not fleeing, but repositioning himself within it. The concealed passages, the redirected sound, the illusion of haunting that discouraged intrusion year after year. Not madness, but method. "He did not vanish," Holmes continued. "He remained, he observed, and when he was finished, he ensured that no one would wish to follow." Holmes produced a small bundle of papers retrieved from a hidden recess behind the sealed wing. Deeds, correspondence, revisions to the household trust. Elias had altered the inheritance quietly, legally, ensuring that control of the estate passed according to terms no one thought to question because no one thought to look. He trusted winter, Holmes said. Trusted silence. Trusted that fear would preserve what locks could not. No one spoke. There was no outrage, no disbelief. Only understanding settling where unease had lived. "And the footsteps?" the woman by the hearth asked softly. "Echoes," Holmes replied. "Architecture, repeating intention. A mechanism long expired, but never dismantled." The West Wing was opened that morning. Not with force, but with deliberation. The door yielded easily, as though it had never resisted at all. Inside, the rooms were orderly, preserved rather than abandoned. Furniture stood draped but intact. Papers lay stacked neatly. The air was cool, but not stale. It was not a place of fear. It was a place of conclusion. As daylight reached into the corridors, the last remnants of the illusion dissolved. Sound behaved honestly. Space revealed itself without deception. The house no longer whispered warnings or rehearsed old performances. Outside, the snow began its slow retreat. Drips formed along the eaves. Paths hinted at re-emergence beneath thinning white. Watson stood beside Holmes at the threshold of the opened wing. "You've given them peace," he said quietly. Holmes shook his head gently. "Peace returns when truth is allowed to rest." By afternoon, the road would begin to reappear. By evening, the manor would belong once more to the present, rather than the season that had protected its secret. As Holmes and Watson prepared to depart, Brackenfell Manor felt different, not emptier, but lighter. The storm had passed. The house no longer needed to hold its breath. And as the first clear tracks appeared in the softening snow, the truth, long buried, carefully preserved, finally stepped into the light and was allowed, at last, to be still.